Good morning to those of you who are in California like me, and good afternoon and good evening to everybody across the world. I'm thrilled to be here and so excited to have a captive audience of CTOs to whom I can preach on the importance of not throwing hiring over the fence. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have some slides for you all. All right. So the title of my talk is Hiring Engineers, the One Thing You Should Micromanage. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, you shouldn't really micromanage anything. But if there is one thing, it is hiring engineers. And I hope I'll convince you that that's the case. Before we get into it, I actually have a few questions for you all. We don't have a way to do formal polls. So instead, I would just love for you to jot down your answers so you can refer to them later. Okay? First question. How many hours do you think your engineering team spends per hire? So this would include things like talking to candidates, interviewing, everything. Okay. So how many hours do you think that is? Okay. Next question. How many hours do you think your recruiting team spends per hire? And finally, and this is a yes or no question, do you, as an engineering leader, actually know what your funnel numbers look like? Well, what do I mean by funnel numbers? That means things like how many of your technical phone screens end up becoming on-sites, how many of your on-sites actually go to offer, and how many of your offers convert to hires. So do you actually have these numbers at the tip of your fingers? Okay, great. We'll come back to some of these a little bit later. So before I get into it, I thought I should introduce myself. My name is Aline. I've been on all sides of the hiring table. So many years ago, I was an engineer myself, then an engineering manager. Then that was the first time really I had to deal with hiring and discovered it was much harder than I thought and ended up making a left turn in my career and working as a recruiter. I really wanted to understand why it was so hard. I ended up running recruiting at a few companies, including Udacity. Then I started my own recruiting firm. And finally, that windy path led me to starting a company called Interviewing.io. Interviewing.io is an anonymous technical interviewing practice platform. So engineers come to us to practice technical interviewing, and top performers can then connect with companies. We've hosted over 100,000 technical interviews in our lifetime, split between practice interviews and real ones. And a lot of what I'll be telling you today is drawn on the data from those interviews. In my career and later at Interviewing.io, we've helped about tens of thousands of engineers find jobs at hundreds of companies, ranging from huge ones like Dropbox and Amazon to small startups who are maybe hiring their third engineer. And I actually observed the same patterns over and over that separated companies who hired well from those who did not. Now, I know keynotes sometimes tend to lean a little bit fluffy. I thought I'd try to make this one as practical and as actionable as possible. We'll see how that goes, but I'm also going to try to tell you some counterintuitive stuff based on data that you probably won't hear in other talks. But first, I wanted to tell you a story. So I mentioned earlier that I used to run hiring at Udacity. Now, we had a lot of candidates that were coming to Udacity because they were attracted by the mission, and the mission was to democratize access to education. It's a great mission. Of course, people are going to be excited about it. And there was one candidate in particular who said that it had been his dream to work in ed tech. So he did really great in his technical phone screen. We flew him in for his on-site, and he happened to mention to me when I was chatting with him that he had a friend who worked at a company in Palo Alto, which was pretty close to us. And that company actually did not ed tech, but ad tech. So an edit distance of one. And he also told me that it would be his worst nightmare to work in ad tech. But, his friend was really just insisting that he come meet the team while he's there. And he did. Well, you can kind of guess where the story is going. We made him an offer. He turned that down, turned down his dream of working in ed tech, and instead took the nightmare offer working in ad tech. And you know why he did that? Because he had better chemistry with the ad tech team. It wasn't about the comp. It wasn't about the mission or the space. The fact that he hit it off with those people and wanted to spend multiple hours a day with them. And really, if there's one takeaway you get from this talk, you have one main job as an engineering leader when it comes to hiring, and it is facilitating that kind of chemistry. Look, hiring engineers is really, really hard for all the reasons that Andy mentioned, and it's getting harder. This is how you win. Now, try as they might, your recruiting team can't do this. Only you and your engineering team can facilitate genuine chemistry. So before we talk about chemistry, let's talk a little bit about the hiring funnel. This is, your funnel might look a little different than this one, but these are the usual steps. And these are conversion rates in a pretty good hiring funnel. So for instance, about 25% of technical phone screens actually make it to onsite. One thing that you might be surprised to learn is that way more engineering time is spent per hire than recruiting time. In this funnel, it's about 1.5x more. This is why you should micromanage eng hiring, because even though it's called recruiting, it's fundamentally an engineering investment. We should accept that, and then we should own it. So how do we make better use of engineering time? Can we actually reduce the hours that we spend while creating as much chemistry and getting as much juice out of those hours as possible? And I say yes. Every interaction with a candidate should be an opportunity to create chemistry between them and your team. And you should look to your funnel with the same critical eye that you look to the rest of your processes and cut inefficiencies while getting the most bang for your buck. So what can you actually do? This is a list. This is really the meat of what I want you to take home today, and I'll talk about each of these points. So how can we micromanage hiring to maximize chemistry and minimize time investment? First thing, get a handle on your funnel metrics and figure out which sources have the best outcomes. You would be shocked by how many eng leaders are bad at this and don't know what their funnel metrics look like. You know the adage about how you can't fix what you can't measure. Most hiring managers I speak to don't know what their funnels look like. We're engineers everywhere else, but somehow we forget to be engineers when it comes to recruiting. And once you actually figure out what your funnel metrics look like, you might see some unexpected things. I could do a whole talk on how to triage your funnel, but one thing you might notice is that you have a very high technical phone screen pass rate and then a very low on-site pass rate. And that might mean that you might want to move some of the questions from your on-site to your technical phone screen, and so on and so forth. But you won't know stuff like this until you pull the numbers and spend some time with that. And then once you do that, you're going to get a visibility into which of your sources actually have the best outcomes. Once you know which of your sources have the best outcomes, you should actually hop in and do some of the intro calls with candidates from those best performing sources instead of recruiting, right? This is your first chance to create chemistry. First impressions are real. They're a real thing. This is also a great way to build relationship with your recruiting team. I know sometimes there's tension between eng and recruiting. Tell them to rope you in with high potential candidates and make them feel good about asking you to do that intro call. You can scope it to a few hours a week, but even this will have a pretty significant impact on your conversion rates down funnel. Next thing, create unique interview questions that sell as much as they vet. In this hiring climate, every interaction with a candidate should be about creating chemistry. And one of the best, most genuine ways to do that is to ask interesting interview questions that will stick in the candidate's head after they leave. So many companies don't spend a lot of time figuring out what to ask. One failure mode I've seen a lot is going to lead code and asking lead code questions verbatim. You're losing such a huge opportunity to build rapport with the candidate, to show them how cool what you're doing is, right? And to make them think about you long after the interview is over. What I normally suggest is to start a shared doc on your engineering team. And every time an engineer on your team does something that they're proud of, it can be one line of code. It can be a function. It can be a big project. It doesn't matter. Something where they want to share it, where they want to tell their friends, hey, look at this clever thing I did. Just have them note that in the doc. And over time, you will create a repository of these little kernels that then you can turn into interview questions. And these interview questions will be practical. They're going to be specific to what you do. And they're going to give candidates a genuine view into what their day-to-day might look like if they work for you. Next, this one's a little bit weird, but I'll talk you through it. Figure out who your super screeners are and put them on phone screens, take them off on sites. So what's a super screener? So this is a word that I made up, but it's an interviewer whose candidates end up getting offers disproportionately often. If you actually do an analysis of your funnel and look at who all your interviewers are and how their candidates are performing, I guarantee you that you will find a pocket of interviewers who have probably similar technical phone screen to on-site conversion rates, but whose candidates, for whatever reason, tend to do better in on-sites and tend to potentially even accept offers more often. Why is that? Because given enough interviewers, there will be some interviewers on your team who are not only well calibrated, but who are also really, really good at selling. And these people aren't just well calibrated for the phone screen. They have some kind of intuition for who's going to do well in the onsite. I've done a lot of work to try to figure out what makes these people magic. And there are a lot of factors. But regardless of what that is, they exist. So find out who these people are and make sure that you put them on phone screens. Because if putting these people on phone screens doubles your on-site to offer rate, all of a sudden you're spending way, way, way fewer eng hours to make the same number of hires. I put a formula here. You don't have to use this one, but if you want to figure out who your super screeners are, you can use this formula to identify them. The people with the highest scores will be the people that you should put on phone screens. Okay. Next, have your interviewers give constructive feedback at the end of interviews, especially for strong candidates. Why does this matter? So on Interviewing.io, like I said, we've hosted over 100,000 interviews, and it's been a treasure trove of really cool interview data. One of the things we ask people after their interview is, how well do you think you did? And this is before they find out how well they did. We also ask people whether they would want to work with their interviewer. And we found a very statistically significant relationship between whether people think they did well and whether they'd want to work with the interviewer. And that sounds a little surprising at first, but if you think about it, right? Let's say you have an interview and you're unsure about how you did, and it really could go either way. And after the interview, and I think we've all done this, you go through this kind of self-flagellation gauntlet, right? Where you're like, I should have said this thing. Oh man, I'm stupid. Or, oh, like that interviewer didn't interview me well. That question wasn't good. And regardless of which of these self-flagellation or flagellating them kind of tracks you go down, over time, over the next few days, you're going to be talking yourself out of working at this company, even though you actually really did well in the interview. And by the time they get back to you and say, hey, actually, you did really well and we want to bring you in, you will have done so many mental gymnastics to talk yourself out of it that you're going to be over it. So how do you combat this? If somebody did very well in your interview, tell them as soon as possible. If you can, tell them right after the interview. I know that not in all processes are interviewers actually empowered to give feedback, but if it's something that your company can do, I would highly recommend it. And let me show you why. So this is a graph of some real data that we have. On the x-axis is their actual score, 1 to 4. 4 means they did very well in the interview. 1 means they did not. And then the y-axis is the perceived score. So that's how well do you think they did. That box in the bottom right that I've outlined in red is kind of the imposter syndrome candidates. And these are the candidates that actually did well but thought they didn't. And the longer you hold off on giving them good feedback, the more likely you are to lose them. Finally, this one is not surprising, I'm sure. You, as the Eng leader, should do a call with every candidate who's getting an offer. Recruiting might actually extend the offers. Maybe recruiting is handling negotiation, because sometimes it can be weird to negotiate with your future boss's boss. It creates some weird power dynamics. But offer negotiation aside, make sure that you actually do a call with every candidate who's getting an offer. Why? Those candidates are about 15 times as valuable as candidates at the top of the funnel. If you do nothing else but improve your close rate from 33%, which is, pretty good funnel standard, to about 50, you're going to save 31 or about 30 Eng hours per hire and 1.5x your hires if you do nothing else. If you actually do all of these things, doing some napkin math, I think you will save about 45 Eng hours per hire. You'll 3x your funnel throughput, and you're just going to make hiring more human, right? Everybody hates being a candidate. Everybody hates feeling like a statistic. And for how hard it is to hire engineers, I don't think anybody is really doing a great job of this, but this is how you start. And I'm hopeful that if more people adopt this strategy over time, hiring will just suck way less for our industry. All right. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Aline. That was brilliant. Okay, right. We do have some questions from the audience. Okay, the first question is from Simon. And his question is, how do you ensure that relying on your super screener intuition doesn't backfire and introduce subjectivity and bias?
That's a really good question. I think the best way to... Do you hear echo? Is it just me? No? Okay, good. So that's a risk that you take. And I think the important thing to do is to keep measuring other aspects of your funnel, right? So if you do adopt this strategy, then keep a close eye on what happens. And if over time you start noticing that certain groups are not passing interviews at the rate that they used to, that's something that you're going to want to take a critical look at. I would say it's probably better to be bold here and lean on your super screeners and then fix issues, rather than being a little bit timid, not leveraging them, and then being afraid of bias. Just make sure you measure. And this goes back to, as an Eng leader, know what your funnels look like and have ready access to that data.
Brilliant. Apologies for the echo, everyone. I'm
I wasn't crazy.
No, it's my fault. Okay, we have another question from Louisa. What tools to use to track the candidate's funnel?
Yes. So probably all of you use some kind of applicant tracking system, or you've probably heard the acronym ATS. That's what that stands for. It's basically a CRM. That's another acronym for managing relationships between you and your candidates. Popular ATSs include Lever, Greenhouse. Maybe if you're at a much bigger company, you're using something like Workday. There's a long list of them. Some applicant tracking systems are much better at reporting than others, but all of them should be able to give you at least a rudimentary funnel. There is, and they're not paying me to say this, there's a new ATS on the market called Ashby, and their differentiator is that they actually let you get your funnel metrics easily. So they will kind of plug on top of your existing ATS, pull everything out, and organize it and tell you what those numbers look like. In the past, when I've done this, I've sometimes just exported raw ATS data into an Excel sheet and just written some nasty Python scripts to do it. Hopefully you don't have to do that. And hopefully whatever ATS you use will give you at least a first pass. And it doesn't have to be perfect. When there are glaring issues, it's not going to be, about maybe you lose some data. Like when there are glaring issues, you will be able to tell. And you don't have to do this perfectly. What matters is that you do it some.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Okay, next one is from Kier. Any advice about how to handle candidates who don't take the feedback well and want to spend time arguing about it or accuse you of bias?
Yeah. So to be safe and to kind of leverage what I suggested, you can confine yourself to giving feedback to candidates that did well, right? Because what you're trying to accomplish there is to not get them into the self-flagellation loop or the self-justification about how they totally didn't want to work for you anyway. Like you want to avoid that and you want them to feel great after the interview as soon as possible. However, I'm glad you asked this question because I was debating about whether to put this little juicy tidbit in my talk. A few years ago, I actually worked with a lawyer to try to figure out if an engineer has ever sued a company for giving constructive post-interview feedback. I know HR will always tell you, like, don't give feedback, it's a liability, at least in the US. And I know not everybody here is in the US, but in the US, this has actually never happened. And as always, HR is sometimes and legal are overcorrecting and in the process sacrificing, some opportunity for engagement. But that doesn't really answer the question, I suppose. If you are giving negative feedback, there is a chance that candidates will become defensive. One of the things that we do on Interviewing IO, because we do give feedback after interviews, if you do feel like giving all candidates feedback, is not starting with whether they passed or failed, but instead getting very constructive and very specific right away. So saying, hey, here in this function, you use this other function and then you didn't account for the additional time complexity that created, right? Or your variable should be named differently, or any number of other things. So by the time you actually get to whether they passed or failed, that is almost moot, right? And it's much more about working through a problem together than judging. People generally get defensive because they feel powerless, not because they disagree that they failed.
Makes sense, yeah. Okay, we have another question from Mark. When you say give feedback immediately afterwards, how soon is that? An hour, a day?
If you can, and this really depends on how your process works. You just may not be able to do this. But I would actually say, like, if your interviewer is empowered, do it right at the end of the interview. If they're sure the candidate passed, and that's not for an onsite. This would be for a technical phone screen. For an onsite, obviously, there's a team of people and they have to meet. So it's hard to give feedback right away. For an interview that's one-on-one, like a technical phone screen, if you can just say at the end, great, that went well, we're going to bring you in for an onsite. If you can't do that, or if you are trying to figure out when to give feedback after an onsite, do it as soon as possible. I know that sometimes it's hard to get everybody in a room to debrief the next day or even same day. I'd say, like, I don't have the numbers for this, but just my intuition tells me there's kind of this exponential drop off for every day that you sit on it. And the sooner that you can give a candidate feedback, the better.
Definitely agree with that. Okay, I think we've got time for one more. We've got one from Fernando. Do you have tips about being a good salesperson without overselling the organization?
Yeah, really, really good question. So the ultimate sales pitch for a candidate follows a very specific format. And that is, one, figure out what they've done up until now, figure out what they want to do, and then find a way to tell the story that everything they've done up until now is culminating perfectly in working for you. And that everything they want to do, they'll be able to do with you. Now, that's easier said than done, because being able to execute on that strategy requires getting a lot of information from the candidate. So as much as possible, especially if you're an eng leader and you're doing those intro calls, spend time asking questions and listening, passing that information on to the rest of your team, being like, this person wants this person wants that. And then make sure that every person who talks to them tells the story of why they're there, right? So you probably have engineers on your team that had multiple offers and then chose to come to you instead of some other place. Why did they choose you when they could have gone to many other great companies? See if they can work that in. Not everybody's going to be able to tell the perfect story of how everything this person ever wanted is going to culminate in working for you. But if you can tell some of that and listen to what they want and pepper it with personal anecdotes about why you're there and why your team is there, you're going to be doing so much better than most companies already.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for Aline. Thank you so much. That was brilliant, really insightful.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Best of luck. Micromanage hiring.
Thanks.